Hey everyone. So today we're just going to go through week 11's webinar for the Udacity Full Stack Web Developer Nano degree. And what this is going to focus on is Linux servers and shell commands, but in the reverse order. Shell commands and then Linux servers, uh, because that's the way you'd learn it. So um, what we're going to touch on is, first of all, why shell commands. So when you build a server for your web application, regardless of what type of web application is, in terms of the size or the type of content that it will be offering, you're essentially going to use an operating system which is completely different to um, a GUI based operating system that a human uses. That's because your server will essentially just be serving uh, requests, so responding to requests by users. So the best way to set this up is by the command line. In many instances, it is the only way to set it up. Not always, and there are some GUIs, but they're nowhere near as effective as um, uh, yeah, basically setting up servers with shell commands. So obviously you need to know quite a few shell commands to do this, but hopefully at this point in the nano degree, you've already encountered quite a lot of them. Um, and so we're just going to brush over exactly how you would do it. And it would be best if you were using, if you were using the GUI that comes along with Linux, it'd be a good idea to just abandon that initially and just go about setting up your next virtual machine with just using shell commands. So um, the most important ones would be to, first of all, um, figure out, how is this operating system going to work? The best way to do it in the way that Udacity's lesson or course on this does it is using a virtual machine. So that's fantastic, because then no matter how many times you mess it up or break it, you know, you don't affect your actual computer, your operating system, and your files. Um, so the virtual machine is just something you can set up, use, experiment with, tear down, reset, and just do that, continuously. But I just want to mention something that's not in the Udacity course, and that's um, an alternative or something that's complementary to a virtual machine, and that would be um, a Docker image. So essentially, a Docker image is um, a lightweight version. It's essentially just a file, and um, uh, it shares a lot of the resources of your operating system, but it doesn't take them all up. So what you can end up having is, say, 10 applications um, requiring the same amount of resources. If they are Docker images, it could use up the same amount of resources as, say, a single virtual machine. And so we won't obviously go into that, but it's just, I guess, important to keep that in the back of your mind. So there's quite a few different uh, let me show you a few different sites that you can go to, which just show you the differences between virtual machines and containers. So I would recommend just going and taking a look at this. Um, I don't want to reference a specific one. I would just, Google um, differences between virtual machines and containers. Sorry, so Docker is just the most popular container, um, but there's plenty of them. So as you can see in this um, image over here, this is basically the architecture behind the two, and it shows that you don't actually need these full guest operating systems when you're using containers, but for virtual machines you do. Um, there are some, drawbacks to this, but yeah, we won't get into it. Just know that a lot of large applications are moving to microservices. Um, Funny enough, a lot are moving back to a monolithic approach of virtual machines. So, without going into it, I just want to mention it to you. So, virtual machines are the way to go in terms of learning to be a full stack web developer, but it's definitely worth your time to go and look into this. So, anyway, the that was just something that I think you should keep in mind. So when you're configuring a virtual machine, you'll just be using a whole bunch of shell commands, and the best way to learn them is just simply do that course that Udacity has configuring a Linux server. Just do that 2 or 3 times in a row from scratch, where you go from uh, you know downloading VirtualBox and Vagrant, setting up your virtual machine, you know, configuring users, and then yeah, setting up your different users, um, sorting out permissions, and first getting your super users, um, and then looking at security, swapping out the um, password-based authentication and putting in secure shell, so SSH keys. Um, so this is just you know the way I look at it is it's almost like if you had to do a new task. Say you I can't think of a good example, but so I'll just take the one that Lorenzo Brown uses, where he bakes a cake. Essentially, like there's certain things that require unique steps, and there's nothing incredibly complex about them, except that they have certain things have to be done in a certain order. And the best way to learn it is just to practice it. And the more you practice it, the more you realize why each step is important. And so that's how I learned, and I think that that's how a lot of people learn how to um, set up their and configure their servers. So a lot of this overlaps with different functions of different types of developers. So some of this, overlaps a lot with DevOps, as well as with sysadmin. So setting up computers for different people, and so essentially all you would be doing is just practicing building this, and pretty soon you forget that you are using different shell commands. You just know them automatically, and your mind is shifting from using the shell commands to figuring out what it is that should be done for what purpose. So setting up um, say an Ubuntu um, OS versus say um, CentOS or some other um, flavor of Linux, or setting up a different type of virtual machine. So once you've gone through all of that, okay, so let's say you've configured a virtual machine, you understand what Docker is, you've set up users, you've enabled super users, so that normal users can't go in and break things that or modify settings that you don't want modified. And you've upgraded your security so that you're no longer using password-based authentication. Then what you want to do is the second part of the I would say the last third of the second lesson in the Udacity course, configuring Linux servers, and that's got to do with the universal firewall. So sudo UFW, and essentially you just keep practicing that. Allow all outgoing, block all incoming, figure out which ports you need, and just do that a few times, probably, and um, maybe you're probably better than me, but you'll probably end up like I did, locking yourself out of your server a few times, and you'd have to just restart the whole thing. But yeah, once you've done that, you start configuring the ports, and once you've done that, the final most important part is to figure out what type of server you want. You want some sort of production server. So, Nginx or Apache is essentially the way to go. The best would be to just set up both of them different times and really get a feel for what you're doing in two different ways and see that a lot of it is very similar. And then essentially what you'll be doing is seeing how all of this ties up to um, the core uh, purpose, which is, serving requests. So serving the content, your database-backed web applications content, and doing it in probably a RESTful way, and drawing all of this back into the other main topics that or core fundamentals that you've hopefully learned, being uh, an understanding of RESTful architecture, the differences between get and post, and um, put and patch, and requests and responses, and that's essentially where your mind should be when building this. Once this becomes second nature, and I think that's what um, I'm really getting at. If you've practiced this repetitively, not mindlessly, but repetitively, in the same way that the only way that you'll get good at driving a car is to do it repetitively and mindfully. So just not mindlessly memorizing, but you know, set up a server, tear it down. Then when you think you know what you're doing, set it up again, um, and keep doing it till you've done it quite a few times and you understand exactly which step comes before you even started on it. Um, and at some point, it's not like you need to memorize everything, but once you start doing this, you will end up just knowing it and knowing why. Um, so I think that's the way to really get the most out of it. Um, and yeah, by doing it that way, you really will cover all of the shell commands you need, and you'll also know how to look up ones that you've forgotten because you'll know exactly what it needs to do. I think that this is far more useful than say giving you a list of the most common shell commands and then this is what this one does and this is what that one does, because I don't know, unless you're really good at just memorizing stuff, once you've done it, you'll forget unless you really understand. Um, Maybe I'm getting a bit too meta here, so I'll just use one more analogy along this line. I'm not sure who I'm taking this from. It's not mine, but essentially, there's two ways to say learn how all the different tools in a toolbox work. So you're given a toolbox, and it's got hammers and screws and screwdrivers and pliers and spanners. Say you were given that, and you were given a textbook or a manual, and it said, so yeah, say you had never seen any of the tools before. Of course, this is a contrived example. If you were given that manual, then and so each tool was labeled in this manual. So you saw a picture of the pliers, then you looked in the toolbox and you saw the pliers. You said, okay, the pliers are a. This is called a plier, and this is used for stripping um, electric cabling, and it's used for um, gripping and pulling different items. And then there was a picture of a hammer, and this is used for nailing in nails. Yeah? That's one way you can learn and just memorize it, and cover the meaning and the name and look at the picture. And so that's one way to figure out what each of the tools in the toolbox are for. But I think a far better way to do it is to be given a toolbox, right? And maybe each tool can have just a label on it, so we all not use the same word for the same tool, but the name doesn't really matter. And then you're given an engine, say for example, or anything, something maybe, and less complex, but you're given some item that you would actually use the tools to work on. and you were told, so say for example was an engine, and you were told, this is an engine, take this engine apart into all of the components and then put it back together, right? At the end of that, you would really understand an engine. It would be far more painful, but you'd really understand what an engine is, um, and how all the parts fit together. And you would also know, as a byproduct, you would know every single tool, what it's useful for, um, what it's not useful for, um, and yeah, you would just know all of the reasons for using each of the tools, and you would have it perfectly memorized, and you wouldn't have been memorizing. And you would know that they're just literally what tools, simply tools. And in the same way, that's what the bringing the analogy back. That's what Linux servers are, and that's what shell commands are. Essentially, just tools to better build your web application. So yeah, I would say that to get a really good grip on this, um, in conjunction with everything else you've already done in this nano degree, and then going through the configuring Linux servers course in Udacity. I think it's given by Michael Wales. I think it's Mark. I hope I'm not Mark Wales. Apologies if I've got it wrong, but yeah, going through that course several times until you can do everything that he does. Without prompting or referring back to the notes. I think that would be a really useful way to get this done. Um, so yeah, hopefully this is still useful. I didn't want to just repeat everything that's been said in the Udacity coursework, um, but by doing that, you should have a really good understanding of Linux servers and the shell commands required. Um, so yeah, if there are no questions, um, then yeah, no questions. Then we'll leave it there for today. Cool. Thank you. Have a good one, and we'll chat in the next webinar or anytime on Slack. Just send a message or question, and I'll get back to you. Cool. Thanks, everyone.